Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the acting director of the Centre of Islamic Studies this year. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the second talk of this term. And this talk is being co-hosted between the Centre of Islamic Studies and the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Hisham Hellyer. Dr. Hellyer is a Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. He's also a visiting fellow at the Centre of Islamic Studies here and a scholar of the Carnegie Endowment. He's also worked as a fellow in Middle East policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington and as a research associate at Harvard University. Dr. Hellyer has published widely on politics and international studies, with a focus on the politics of the modern Arab world, as well as questions of religion and politics in Europe and internationally. He's the author of several books, including A Revolution Undone, Egypt's Road Beyond Revolt, which was published in 2016 with Hurst and Oxford University Press, and also of Muslims in Europe, the quote-unquote other Europeans, published in 2010 with Edinburgh University Press. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Hellyer here today. His talk is entitled The New Geopolitics of the Middle East, Back to the Future, ?
Paul, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining the Centre of Islamic Studies today, where I'm pleased to be a visiting fellow, and the Centre for Geopolitics, who are co-hosting this event at the University of Cambridge this evening. When Joseph Biden became the president of the United States earlier this year, there were flurries of articles and commentaries insisting that he would, quote unquote, pivot to Asia, and that at the very least, the wider Arab world and the Middle East region would be deprioritized. I know, I wrote one of them. My colleagues and I, in what pundits often call the blob, that nebulous group of analysts, academics, media commentators, and policy wonks inside and outside of government, deployed various arguments to justify our positions for that particular idea. I don't deny those arguments, and I think they generally hold true. The broad trend of American diplomacy, which indelibly affects the rest of Western diplomacy, as DC is still the Rome of the modern Western empire, is indeed in that direction. The developing geopolitics of the world means that China is indeed a growing power of the future, and frankly, we're already in that future. But what I think most of those arguments did not note emphatically enough, perhaps because analysts of the region take this for granted, is that a Biden White House was never going to simply cut and run from the region. So it's not very feasible to think about that, at least not in the short to the medium term, and probably beyond that. The broader Middle East continues to be very relevant for Western policymakers. For Europeans, it's because it's on our doorstep. We share the Mediterranean Sea with the region. We have extensive trade relations with it. We share borders with it. For Washington, there are economic, military, and other relationships that are frankly not going to simply evaporate. Nor does it seem do we, as Westerners, actually want to cut and run anyway. There's too much to be gained from those trade relationships, to put it bluntly, on the one hand, and we continue to want to see stability, in quotation marks, in countries that are close to us because, again, bluntly, we are concerned as to what it means for us if they become unstable. And I put stable and unstable all in quotation marks because we use those words in ways that are essentially self-serving and bear little resemblance to what genuine, rooted, sustainable stability actually means. We also, unfortunately, continue to view the region via frames and lenses that diminish and depreciate what the region means for the people that matter most in this regard, not the regimes that govern or fail to govern the region, but for the masses of people that live there. But we'll come back to all of that later on. What I want to discuss tonight is all that I've mentioned thus far, but more than that. I want to get into what the geopolitics actually are most of all about and what they mean. I'm going to be discussing different axes and poles of influence and what they're based on. And I'm going to be doing this as a Western academic, a Western analyst attached to this fine institution of Cambridge as a visiting fellow, but also as a senior associate of RUSI and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as a veteran of not just one, but three of DC's think tanks, Brookings, Atlantic Council, and now I'm pleased to say Carnegie. And I mentioned that just to position how my comments are going to be informed tonight. There's most certainly a very strong policy angle to this. But I'm not going to be speaking from purely that vantage point. And I want to foreground that in advance, because my interest in the region isn't simply that of an interested, dispassionate external observer whose English father and grandfather and great grandfather and so on, until I frankly have no idea, were of the British Isles. My interest is of that of someone who is of the region, the son of a Cairene lady whose own parents were of Egyptian, Sudanese, and Moroccan extraction. My interest is that of an Englishman, a European, and a Westerner, but also of an Arab who was born in the region, spent many years living there during my formative years, and who chose to spend much of the last decade and more within it, attempting to bear witness to the tumultuous and painful and glorious events of that time. And I want to really foreground these perspectives, because all too often we do tend to analyze or interpret the events underway in the region without keeping in mind whom it matters most to, the people of the region, the people who live there, the people who are tied to it after they're forced to leave it, the people for whom there is no other real home on this planet of ours. We need to center them and their stories as we try to understand what is happening there, at least as much as we try to understand what it means to us as Britons, as Europeans, as Westerners. In March of 2016, then US President Barack Obama said that wars and chaos in the Middle East would not end until Saudi Arabia and Iran could find a way to share the neighborhoods and make some kind of peace. And there's much to unpack from this statement of sharing the neighborhood in many different ways, but I'll pick on 2 points. The first, which I think is an overriding concern, is simply the way in which this turns the region to some kind of 18th century tribal fiefdom, where two empires led by imperial leaders can divide the spoils between them. But alas, this does permeate a lot of discussions we have about the region. I'm not sure I know that many people in the region who would want to live under either Saudi Arabian or Iranian hegemony if they could have a better option, say, accountable and representative government that protected their fundamental freedoms and rights. But all too often, we continue to see the region in that fashion. That phrase, sharing the neighborhood, particularly stuck in my craw when I heard it. But it is so common to speak in that way, whether in London or in DC or any other Western capital for that matter. But the second point, which is why Obama's statement was so peculiar in 2016, is from a geopolitical analytical lens. Because this competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran was no longer the only major one in town, even in 2016. There was a new competition that had been picking up steam since early 2012 and had crystallized in 2013. And that competition was fundamentally between two axes. And without understanding these two axes, one will find it very difficult to understand how the region's geopolitics are evolving. It's rather difficult, if not impossible, frankly, to understand the main poles of power in the region today without presenting a definition of a singularly notorious word, that of Islamism. And I say it is notorious because it means so many different things to so many different people. And yet it continues to have utility because so many people continue, as they have done for many decades now, to self-describe as Islamists. There are particular definitions and levels of definitions in many fields. And I think Islamism is no different in this regard. The most broad level would be the following. Islamism is the instrumentalization of certain interpretations of Islam by people who would describe themselves as Islamists for the purpose of political power. And I think that's a fair definition, and I think all those elements are quite important. Firstly, it is important to note that Islamism is fundamentally about instrumentalization, and that instrumentalization is fundamentally about power. Secondly, I think it is important to note that it is a self-ascribed label, i.e., while few people in English might describe themselves as Islamists, although there are some, there are certainly many who do so in Arabic. In English, the corresponding label might be the quote-unquote Islamic movement. And thirdly, it's important and necessary, I think, to distinguish between Islam as a normative noun to delineate the religion in its normative forms, historically speaking, and Islamism, which is by and large reliant on modernist interpretations that find their roots in the last 100 years. And it's for this reason that so many opponents to Islamism happen to also often be deeply religious and often quite conservative Muslims themselves. But I digress, and that's not really the topic of today. But I think it's important to note what Islamism is actually defined as in order to understand how these axes that I'm about to elaborate upon actually distinguish themselves from one another. The first axis is the Qatari-Turkey network axis. When it comes to Qatar, we're talking about a singular nation state. When we talk about Turkey, we're referring to the Erdogan-led AK party within Turkey. And attached to this axis, I would argue, is a broader network of Muslim Brotherhood movements. And when we discuss them, we're referring to the vast networks that exist in the Arab world that claim some kind of fealty or inspiration by the Brotherhood. It's an interesting conglomerate and not one that is necessarily ideologically cohesive. Qatar wouldn't fathom of democratic elections. Turkey has a lot of procedural democracy, even if the increasing autocratic tendencies sometimes put stress on those processes. The Brotherhood is historically a modernist Salafi movement from Muhammad Abdu and so on. Qatar is historically a Wahhabi kingdom, even while it has supported many Brotherhood elements in the region. While Turkey's religious establishment is fundamentally attached to a more normative, historically speaking, normative Sunnism, distinct from modernist Salafism, which created a very different type of Islamism unique to Turkey and quite unlike the Muslim Brotherhood. The second axis is arguably just as disparate. The Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian axis found itself thrown together, particularly after the end and suspension and then final end of the democratic experiment in Egypt in 2013. The religio-ideological consistency is just as absent. The Saudis continue to uphold purist Salafism as the true form of Islam, while the UAE and Egypt, at least officially, are far more inclined to support normative Sunnism in terms of doctrine, even if it's a particular take on that Sunnism in order to ensure that, politically speaking, it doesn't quite get out of line. There will be those who argue that the latter axis is the counter-revolutionary axis, and the former is the revolutionary axis. And I'm not sure this really explains the region particularly well. When the uprisings of Libya and Syria began, the Emiratis and the Qataris both supported them, even while they supported different actors on the ground. When the Bahraini uprising began, both of these same GCC states opposed it. It's not about support for revolution or opposition to it even per se, but rather about what outcome serves a particular state's cynical interpretation of its own self-interest. When Sudan, for example, faced its own uprising a couple of years ago, all of these actors opposed it to begin with. And eventually they all signed up to it, seeing that their interests would be served accordingly. But there are certain things that do tie the different axes together, and that has to do with the convergence of interests and attitudes vis-a-vis the role of specifically mainstream Islamist political groups and the continuation of political orders in the region that meet their purposes. For the pro-Qatar, pro-Turkey, pro-MB axis, due to their own sympathies with political Islamism that find their roots in the MB and sympathetic movements like the AKP in Turkey, that generally means supporting uprisings where this would increase their reach in this regard and not where it wouldn't. And the opposite, obviously, is going to be the case for the Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian axis. Now, I hasten to add two additional points. These axes are not only rifted internally in terms of actual doctrine, but also in terms of political assessments as well. So, for example, the Emiratis and Saudis viewed Syria in a particular way until relatively recently, which was quite at odds with the way that Cairo looked at it following 2013. The same was true and remains to be true when it comes to the disastrous war in the Yemen, although now the Emiratis and the Saudis differ on that score as well between themselves. So using the axes as frames of reference for analysis is useful, but not always the complete and total picture. The second point is that the anti-MB axis is not above instrumentalizing religion for partisan political purposes. Far from it. If that instrumentalization is a main feature of the former axis, it is certainly not less than at least a prominent characteristic of the latter one. We've seen the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Saudis instrumentalize religion many times to promote their own visions for the region, and domestically so. None of that is exceptional or unusual for them to do so. It's entirely in keeping with how they look at the world. I would argue it is also incredibly and tremendously unhealthy. There might be differences with the pro-MB axis in this regard, of course. For example, anti-Christian sectarianism, which can be often found in the pro-MB axis. But one can also find anti-Shi'i sectarianism in the anti-MB axis. We used to say in the UK that British politicians don't do God, unlike our American counterparts. Well, in these axes, everyone does God, for better or for worse, and usually for worse. We also cannot say with any degree of seriousness that one axis is more pro-nation state than the other. The Turks are tremendously pro-nation state, for example, as are the Emiratis and the Egyptians. So there are questions to be raised here about how cohesive the conceptual alignments actually are. But it is very clear. They are poles, they are axes, and they are axes that have clashed tremendously in recent years. The Saudi Arabian, United Arab Emirates, and Egyptian axis versus the Qatari Turkey axis has, in the words of the International Crisis Group, and I quote, polarized Arab politics, cast a long shadow over North Africa, for years split the Syrian opposition, and now plays out in the Horn of Africa, notably exacerbating rifts among Somali factions. Now, excuse me. As the axes crystallized from 2013 to 2016, they were met with a new opportunity, that of the Trump administration at the beginning of 2017, which encouraged and emboldened the worst impulses from within those axes. And surely thereafter, that meant a crucial break within the GCC, one that meant that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt severed diplomatic ties with and blockaded, boycotted, depending on your perspective, Qatar, demanding that it break with the MB, demanding that it close the Turkish military base, demanding that it shut down its Al Jazeera news network, among other demands. Demands that were never particularly likely to be met, but they were made anyway, and they indeed were never met. But it doesn't mean that these two poles are not real. They are very real, and they continue to be very relevant. Now, for all that I've said so far about how important these poles are, I'm reminded of another talk that I gave a few years ago at another academic gathering at the 30th anniversary of the Journal for Islamic Studies on the same topic, after having explained these axes quite similar to how I've just done. And I said after that, now, having established the usefulness of those frames for understanding and analysis, and I stand by that, I will now seemingly contradict myself, because I fundamentally believe that going forward, these frames are going to become increasingly irrelevant. And I still think that bears out today, and even more so. The poles remain, but they operate nevertheless in a wider region that is not a vacuum, that has various push and pull factors, which create all kinds of opportunities when powers become exhausted. That happened with the GCC crisis. Even while the existence of the Trump administration and what awful things it did for the deterioration of the international and regional orders, let alone at home in the United States, was crucial for the beginning of the GCC crisis, that same administration was pushing Riyadh to end the crisis towards the end of its term. Perhaps the coronavirus pandemic was partly responsible. Perhaps the shifting of geotectonic plates due to the Abrahamic Accords, which we won't spend too much time on in my speech, but perhaps in the Q&A, we'll give it whatever time it does deserve, which probably isn't particularly much. Riyadh eventually felt the need to clean the deck. Perhaps the victory of Joe Biden as president meant that Riyadh had to renew its importance in DC, perhaps its most important global ally, and perhaps all of the above. In any case, it meant that the GCC crisis came to a rather quick end at the beginning of this year, and the rapprochement followed. For all the rhetoric of demonization going back and forth, Saudi and Qatari officials are back on good terms. Even between Cairo and Doha, that is true. We've seen that in recent months when the Turks unexpectedly gave all kinds of signals about wanting to mend bridges with the Egyptians, whom they'd vigorously opposed following the end of the Morsi government in 2013, due to the military overthrowing the government of that day following widespread protests. Turkish-Egyptian differences were rooted in that initial issue of 2013, but they fast developed in other areas. Cairo became part of this wider axis that was opposed to the Turkish-Qatari pole. Cairo and Turkey were on different sides in Libya, and so on. And yet, despite all of that, relations have improved quite substantially in the last few months, to the point where we expect the Turkish foreign minister to go to Cairo in the coming weeks. When it comes to Libya also, one of the major places of difference and distinction between these two axes, things have moved. It wasn't long ago that the country was the venue for one of the most severe conflicts between these two axes. The UAE and Egypt were basically on one side and the Turks and the Qataris on the other. But that didn't last indefinitely. The UAE and Egypt see things now quite differently from each other, partly, frankly, because while Cairo can afford to be maximalist domestically, it is actually quite pragmatic beyond its borders, and particularly when it comes to a country that it shares a massive border with, Libya. And it frankly comes at a good time. The combination of different political moves domestically and externally managed to bring an end to the stalemate in Libya and resulted in a unity government. That's good news for Libya and for the region, because it reduces the potential for further conflict between the two poles in Libya. So yes, there is a thawing, and the thawing is continuing, particularly between Egypt and Turkey, and there are other moves that are afoot. When the Biden administration took office, Cairo was particularly concerned about what this might mean for Egypt, considering Biden's pointed attack of Sisi during his presidential campaign, calling him Trump's favorite dictator. And certainly relations between Cairo and DC are nothing compared to what they were under Donald Trump. The temperature is much cooler as compared to then. But having said that, the honeymoon of the divorce, as it were, is over. The recent crisis in the Holy Land, with Israel bombarding Gaza in yet another round of incredibly disproportionate force and frankly war crimes, brought a huge reminder to the Biden administration, as well as to the rest of the region, that for all the talk about a resetting of the region due to the Abraham Accords, we were back to the future. The Biden administration didn't suddenly engage with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis to address this crisis. They went to the powers that actually had genuine leverage. And those were the Egyptians and the Jordanians, particularly the Egyptians, and especially the Egyptians, as they were the ones who had strong relations with Hamas in Gaza, the Israelis, and the Palestinian Authority. And you can't ignore that sort of reality in favor of some kind of peculiar imaginary restructuring. It was also a reminder to the other axis of Turkey and Qatar. They couldn't, nor did they really even try to take over the role that Egypt and to a lesser extent Jordan actually had. It's simply not possible. So if there can be competition in some places, but if these axes cannot really compete on the Israel-Palestine file of all files in a time of crisis, then how important are the axes altogether anyway? And then we look at the harshest differences of all, those between Qatar and the UAE, and Turkey and the UAE. Even those are beginning to thaw. There are reports of meetings between high-level officials, and that's likely to continue, because as much as there will be distrust between these actors, the reality is, following through on that distrust, escalating the tension, only brings dividends if the surrounding atmosphere is conducive to that resulting in some kind of Machiavellian benefit. And the surrounding atmosphere simply isn't conducive to that. On the contrary, what recent history shows us is that such escalation brings about nothing, even when there is an occupant in the White House that encourages the most outlandish and irresponsible behavior, which happened with Donald Trump. The moment it became clear that Trump might not actually get a second term, calculations were changed across the region among American allies, and they all pointed to one inescapable conclusion: that an escalation in tensions would bring about no bonuses and would almost definitely result in more losses. Part of that, of course, has to do with not only the absence of a Trumpian imperative, but also the presence of a Biden imperative, which in regards to the region involves a return to the Iran nuclear deal. The Saudis and the Emiratis in particular are going to be quite concerned about that. And they know that they stand a much better chance of ameliorating how much damage such a deal might cause for their own interests, given Tehran's designs on the region, if they're able to positively engage with DC. Indeed, the Saudis are probably not convinced that the previous Trump strategy of maximum pressure has done particularly much good. And if they want to find a way to minimize damage in the coming period, they can't have bad relations with DC. For all the poles and axes that might arise, relations with the most powerful superpower in the world remains paramount in some way. But let's be clear, the ideological divisions that I pointed out earlier remain, and they are salient. And the damage in many arenas has already been done in magnificently destructive ways. Not least, one has to be clear, in Syria, where the most brutal regime in my lifetime, with the assistance of the Iranian regime, has managed to destroy so much of Syria. And I wanted to mention this in particular because there is some kind of ridiculous nonsense that portends that the main perpetrator of evil in Syria is actually the West or external Arab meddling actors. It isn't, and that's nonsense. It's the Assad regime and its allies who sacrificed the well-being of Syria on the altar of geopolitics, maintaining a certain level of geopolitical balance that they felt would be upset by the presence of a more representative government in Syria. Even with the combined damage done by the nihilistic and barbaric ISIS group across the world, it cannot compare to the brutality of the Assad regime in Syria alone. And it will be the albatross that we rightfully wear across our necks as the so-called international community that could not stop what was happening there. The same is true in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia has created so much destruction of its own against another cultish and caustic group, that of the Houthis, and that conflict, while thankfully winding down in terms of intensity of violence, will mean scars for yet another generation of Yemenis who deserve so much better. Lest we be under any illusion, the divisions remain and they are salient. But as I said earlier, it's only a matter of time when we're going to have to surpass them at some point. And it's not going to be in the far distant future. Because, and this is where I think we really need to consider things very carefully as we look at the future, there are going to be new fault lines in this part of the world. And those fault lines are going to be far more existential than ideology. It's not a cheerful thing to have to note that demographic developments combined with the impending climate crisis that is slowly but surely creeping upon us are probably going to make all these arguments that we've seen play out in the last decade or so seem rather inconsequential. But that, I think, is the reality of our situation. The climate crisis is a real and prescient danger to not only our children and our grandchildren, but I suspect to most of us who are listening right now. It gets worse with time, true, but it doesn't skip us over. The impacts are already becoming quite self-evident. The question for us as scholars and those trying to explain this region, how will the region respond to this? And what will those countries do going forward? Are they going to form new alliances as water becomes a prized commodity? And we've already seen the tensions over the Renaissance Dam project in Ethiopia for a number of countries upstream, particularly Sudan and Egypt. Are they going to engage in new conflicts due to environmental pressures? How will their intellectual universes face these new challenges, hitherto unheard of in human history? As yet, we have precious little evidence to support much in the way of intellectual creativity by way of theories and speculations, and that in itself is deeply concerning. Instead, we say the playing out of petty tribalism on the regional and international stages under the guise of intellectual inquiry, rather than the exploration of genuine knowledge aimed at addressing these issues. If we had even a portion of attention that was dedicated to the supporting of authoritarianism, or in contrast, the supporting of different types of autocratic political Islamism, and reapportion that instead to analyzing the predicament that the world finds itself in the climate crisis, that would be monumental indeed. If I may, I would suggest that as we try to understand the world within academic circles, more generally speaking, we do the following. The first is to recognize that the world is indeed moving very, very fast. Again, for better or for worse, and again, often for worse. We need to adapt very quickly, and that does not come always it does not come very easily to the academic. We live in a time that is unlike any other, where the pace of change is unlike any other period that came before it. Indeed, it would not be hyperbole to note that 10 years of change in this century can be as impactful, again, for better or for worse, as 100 years of change in other centuries. And we are not so ready for that as we might imagine. Secondly, I think we have to recognize that hitherto, we've not sufficiently drawn on all the resources within the academy and promoted different voices enough, different voices that represent our diversity of gender, our diversity of ethnicity. I would humbly suggest that we all, without question, without exception, and myself included, that we need to do a lot better in this regard. This is not about tokenism. This is about realizing that different perspectives emanate from different life experiences, and different perspectives enrich our discussions at a time when we so desperately need new perspectives. As an academic, but also as someone who moves in policy think tanks and research institutes, I'm astounded as we see panels of experts on countries in the region that they fail to speak the language of, that they do not visit for more than a week or two out of the year, or both. We need to do better. And finally, I would offer a call that encourages us all to support our intellectual spaces, including most certainly within this very university, within the virtual walls of which we ought to be gratified we are having this discussion. There are going to be tremendous pressures insisting that we reallocate resources and time away from various topics and subjects, and we have to ensure that as we move forward in this next phase, we do so with the recognition that knowledge is indeed its own virtue, and that come what may, we are called upon to be more, not less human, and humans without knowledge can simply not uphold their fundamental freedoms, rights, and responsibilities. Now, usually at this point, the audience expects me to deliver new solutions, new paradigms, and new ideas. I have students that ask me about this from within the realm of political science. I have concerned, deeply committed individuals from within the Arab world that ask me about this from within the realm of activism. I have policymakers in different countries who ask me about this from within the machinery of government. And I'm afraid I'll disappoint all of you there because I don't have new paradigms or new solutions. What I have is an example. I have the example of Tunisia, which to mind is far more than simply the best result of the Arab Spring uprisings of 2010, 2011. It's also a model of how to negotiate these differences domestically, because Tunisia continues to be its own battleground domestically for the two main axes in the region. And they manage. Tunisians manage because they recognize that the democratic experiment that they have is far better than what they had before or anything else that they can presently imagine. So they manage those differences. Tunisia is far more stable and is underpinned by one of the true gains of the Arab Spring, a consensus-built constitution that upholds fundamental freedoms for Tunisians. Again, one might think the different poles do not play a role in Tunisia because of all of this, and one would be definitely wrong for thinking so. Of course, they do play a role because they pick sides in Tunisia and those sides argue with and snipe at each other. But here again is the difference. They do so within the framework of a system of government that can contain those differences and ensure they do not go so far as to result in cataclysmic civil strife. That's a massive win, even if the bar is set rather low. If we're going to have large and majestic discussions around geopolitics, around grandiose theories on grand bargains, let's be sure to note, we need to root it in two things. And those two things entail the sum of the answer that I give to those policymakers, to those analysts, and to those students anytime they ask. My answer will always be the same. And perhaps you'll find this cynical, but in the world in which we live, I frankly find it radical. Because I simply tell them this: to be true and to be honest. I tell them to be true to the ideal of upholding fundamental freedoms that are the birthright of every human being on this earth. And I tell them to be honest in bearing witness to the abuses, the trauma, the horror of appalling conditions in this part of the world for so many people of this part of the world. I tell them that if they really want to know what's happening on the ground, that they should listen to the human rights activists who document these things at great odds from within these countries or have been forced to flee as a result of threats to themselves and their families. A huge sacrifice indeed. I tell them never to accept the Faustian argument of considering things as, well, it's just too damn complicated. That wrong is wrong and right is right. That occupation is occupation, irrespective of how apologists for occupation want to describe it. That authoritarianism is authoritarianism. It's irrespective of how much people want to try to dress it up as some kind of lesser of two evils. That extremism is extremism. And that is true whether it is underpinned by some of the heretical neo-interpretations of religion or indeed right-wing forces that claim to be religious or anti-religious. I tell them to reject treating the peoples of this region as being somehow incapable or unable to live free and to live free well. That this kind of soft bigotry, and it's actually really very hard bigotry, of low expectations is what allowed the colonial project to continue, what allowed our support for autocrats and dictators to continue, what allowed occupation and dispossession to continue, and that the peoples of this region deserve better. And perhaps you were all expecting me to give some kind of grand theory about how to replace the current geopolitical dispensation, and with what precisely. But if I'm honest about this, the truth is this: no grand theory is going to make that much of a difference unless it has at its root either a prescription for including the upholding of fundamental rights and freedoms, or a provision for allowing the space to develop so that such freedoms and rights can be arrived at. And the latter on its own is very risky indeed, because in the meantime, there are all sorts of unexpected consequences we may have to deal with. Be true and bear witness. I have really nothing more important than that. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hisham, for a very interesting account and view of the region, and particularly this idea of the axes and the poles, which seem on the face of it to be a powerful model, but then, as you say, things are actually a lot more complicated after that period of consolidation.